Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. In this episode, we'll discuss the second Sunday of Advent, which this year falls on December 5th.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode. So our deep dive for today is on John the Baptizer, also known as John the Baptist, but we don't want to get into denominations today. That's not what this is about. And particularly, we thought we would talk about John the Baptist in the Gospel of Luke, because that's the Gospel we're exploring this year.
Yes, last week we dove deep into the Gospel of Luke as a whole, and now one of its very important characters who appears uniquely in Luke.
And who's definitely a character.
Yes, who's definitely a character, definitely unique, and definitely uniquely a character in Luke.
Yes.
One of the cool things about Luke is, as we talked about last week, we get the birth story for Jesus, but we also get the birth story for John. So we get in the first chapter of Luke the story of Zechariah, who is one of the priests serving at the temple, and he is the one selected to go into the Holy of Holies. One priest does that every time. It's only one, and it's a very special honor, and they tie a rope around you in case you see God and die, and then they can drag you back out.
I mean, I suppose you could also just have a random aneurysm.
Right, you could also have a random aneurysm,
like,
or
I'm just saying.
Stroke or something, yeah.
There are lots of ways to die.
There are indeed lots of ways to die. So, Zechariah goes in, and while he is in there, he is greeted by an angel of God who says that he's going to have a child. Zechariah questions the angel because he and his wife Elizabeth are quite on in years. And so the angel says, all right, you can't say anything till the kid is born.
Yeah, like, seriously, Zechariah, an angel shows up in the Holy of Holies and talks to you, and you
like, that's literally why you're
angel.
there.
Like, yeah, no, that's not the wise move.
So, utilizing some authority and power that many of us wish we had, the angel silences this man. And people are wondering what is going on, and events unfold as the angel said they would, and Elizabeth becomes pregnant. In the midst of Elizabeth's pregnancy, when she is about 6 months in, Mary comes to visit, and John engages in the first acts of pointing towards Jesus by moving around in Elizabeth's stomach. Elizabeth credits it as the Holy Spirit stirring in John to point towards Jesus.
So what kind of dance move was it?
Right, we're not sure what kind of dance move. Also, babies move all the time in utero. So Elizabeth has this beautiful proclamation about Mary, which is where the Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee, that prayer that Catholics pray as part of the rosary, comes from Elizabeth.
And there is a Lutheran version of that.
Huh. I think I had heard that, but I don't know the Lutheran version.
I think it basically takes out one line.
Oh.
But I don't remember which line. So.
Okay, so if we can find it, we will include it in the episode description. So, in response to Elizabeth proclaiming Mary, then Mary responds with what is known as the Magnificat, which we will talk about in 2 episodes for Advent 4. That'll come up. And then John is born, and people ask Elizabeth what the name of the baby is, and they're like, oh, the baby's name is going to be Zechariah after his father. And Elizabeth says, no, the baby's name is going to be John. And people are like, what? Zechariah, are you sure? And Zechariah has learned some lessons, and so writes on, like, with a piece of chalk or something, writes, the baby's name is John. And behold, Zechariah is able to speak again.
I do kind of wonder how long it took him to figure that out, that he could talk again. Because if you haven't been able to talk, like, I would imagine that his first instinct was not to try to talk. And so, was it a few days until Elizabeth, say, asked him a random question and he responded without thinking about it?
Yeah, because it had been, a good 9 months of not talking.
Several months, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's a long time.
Yeah. I wonder how much additional silence Elizabeth got.
Yeah.
In Luke 3, we bump into John again when we see John in his ministry to baptize people. And he quotes Isaiah.
Mm-hmm. And the Isaiah quote is It's a fun Isaiah quote. I'm a fan of it. And he calls the group that is coming, especially those who are coming more for show than anything else, a brood of vipers, which, if you'll remember back to our episode for the 15th Sunday after Pentecost, basically, John is cussing them out. So that is one of those reminders of cussing is not always a bad thing. We just have different words for it now than we did in the Bible. But so John gets into it with them about hypocrisy and about bearing fruits worthy of repentance, which doesn't ever actually make sense when you dissect that sentence, but about putting their actions behind this particular action of seeking baptism.
Yes, but I would like to point out for a moment that the vast majority of snakes are just, going about their business and having a day and aren't trying to do anything to you. Like, vipers are poisonous, that's different. Venomous, I guess, is actually the word. But calling someone a snake just, isn't it in itself an insult, because snakes can be kind of cool.
Until you get into the, contemporary connotations of snakes being sneaky and evil and Slytherins and...
Several of which come from the Bible. Yes. Yeah. But snakes themselves, as an animal, many of them are perfectly pleasant. I had a science teacher in middle school who was very fond of them. So Luke 3 is largely about John's ministry, and something else that he does at that point is speak truth to Herod because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, and because of all the evil things that Herod had done. The whole thing with Philip's wife is kind of a long story, but basically Herod was claiming to be in charge of the Jewish people and was also breaking Jewish law at the same time, and John was not thrilled about that. If you're going to say that you have authority over us and that you are enforcing our rules in particular, then maybe you should live by them, genius.
Mm-hmm.
Just saying.
Or just pull a King Henry and start your own branch and,
And get divorced, yeah.
Yeah.
I think we just accidentally compared Episcopalians to Herod, but... Sorry, guys.
I mean, not Episcopalians, just the, initiator.
Just the original.
Episcopalians. We love Episcopalians.
We do, yes. And another thing that we notice about John, and that many of us learned in Sunday school, is that John is a fan of wearing slightly unusual outfits. You can see John coming down the street because he is not dressed like everyone else. Wearing a hair shirt is a method of constant self-repentance, basically. It itches all the time, and so you are constantly reminded that you are wearing it. There's no getting away from it. There's no comfort in it.
Mm-hmm.
Someone walking down the street in an outfit like that, you're gonna notice.
Yes.
And so John was never really interested in fitting in. He was perfectly happy to be unusual and be noticed.
Yes. I am less about the John's weird outfits than Kay is, but I think both of us really appreciate John's intentionality and consistency with speaking truth to power, whether it's the folks who are coming to get baptized because it's what you do, or it's what everybody's doing, or if it's, the king who has the power to do all sorts of things to you.
Yeah. I think I locked into John's unusual taste in clothing, in particular because for large parts of my life I had little to no control over my own wardrobe, which was definitely impacted by the fact that I got very tall at a fairly young age, and therefore finding clothes became markedly more difficult. But also I was constantly broke, and before I left high school I really had almost no control over my wardrobe. And so I did not look like everyone else for reasons beyond my control, so I took comfort in the fact that there were people who didn't look like everyone else because they didn't want to. And that was helpful to me.
Yeah, that makes sense. I thought you were going to say because of all of the nerding out you've been doing about fashion and
well, yes,
historical
possibly
fashion.
That too. I mean, to be fair, making a hair shirt, okay, so that was made with, there were a few different things you could make that out of, but it's not easy. It's not, you don't make it out of stuff that people normally make clothes out of, and people usually choose stuff to make clothes out of that are easy to work with. So it takes a lot of extra effort. So I kind of wonder if he made it himself.
He might have. I have heard of people making clothing, making wool and clothing out of their pet's fur.
Yes, and depending on what your pet is, it might even be designed for that. Angora bunnies make Angora wool, just like Angora goats do, which is a little unusual, but...
Yeah.
You don't usually get the same kind of wool out of two different animals.
Yeah, just, I personally will probably not do that because I, A, don't have pets right now, and B, the two most common pets, cats and dogs, are the two things that I'm allergic to. So
Yeah,
that would not
That probably would not be great.
Yeah. Anyway, as the Gospel of Luke continues, John's role shifts a little bit and becomes much more of a comparison role with Jesus. And so those who are upset with Jesus, trying to challenge Jesus, those sorts of things, are trying to pin, like in Luke 5, they try to pin John's disciples against Jesus' disciples, right? So they're calling Jesus' disciples and Jesus like gluttons and drunkards, and so Jesus is like, okay, you're calling like John's disciples come fasting and you say that they're bad, and now we're not fasting and you say that we're bad. And so Jesus points out the divide and conquer that people are trying to use to split John and Jesus into two different things. Similar, I think, to the approach that many white folks and folks who wanted to perpetuate white supremacy during the civil rights movement did with Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, to say, no, y'all are totally different, when in fact they actually had a lot of similarities and worked well together.
Yeah. And then in John chapter 7, we hear that John hears the rumors of Jesus going around, and he asks his disciples if Jesus is the one he's been waiting for.
And by the one, we do not mean like in the YA series Matched. There's no romance between John and Jesus here.
Yeah.
Sorry to heartbreak. Although there's probably fan fiction about it.
I'm absolutely certain. But I was also going to point out that they are cousins, and the taboo that Americans have against cousins in romantic relationships has not been 100% in evidence in all cultures around the world. I have no idea about biblical Israel, but...
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are actual instructions in the Bible about keeping property within families and tribes.
Yeah.
So not necessarily cousins, but a little bit larger than that. And I think most of the cousin taboo is around, like, wanting to maintain genetic diversity. So the place where it really comes out is actually, once again, calling out the UK for their monarchies, right? And monarchies where they're trying to keep bloodlines, quote-unquote, pure. Might also have to do with a certain UK-based magical wizarding world.
But overall, like, as we look at John's life, I just also want to point out that he kind of got the short end of the stick on things. Like, congratulations, you're going to point to the Messiah. You're going to die painfully. We'll get to that in a minute. And you're not going to get to see the Messiah do the really exciting stuff. And but you'll be cousins, and you'll point in his direction, but you're gonna wear a hair shirt, which is gonna be uncomfortable, and you will spend literally the rest of eternity being compared to the Son of God over and over and over again. So have fun with that.
Right, and unsurprisingly, the Son of God will be preferred.
Yeah.
Which a little bit reminds me of, in 7th grade, we had an English teacher who had us read kids' books, and then frequently compared us to the 3rd and 4th graders he had taught before, and the 3rd and 4th graders were always better than us. He did not make it a year.
Okay.
But,
to be fair, I've taught both of those age groups, and
I mean,
I find it hard to disagree with them. I mean, so I like middle schoolers because they are just getting to the stage where they start asking the really interesting questions. But they're also in that stage where they are testing every single boundary all the time, and that gets old pretty fast.
Yeah. I don't think we were doing that as much as just, like, it was the, like, they did this better. And it's like, why are you making 7th graders do the same work that 3rd and 4th graders are doing? But okay. Yeah.
No, I had, like, 3 elementary school teachers come to us from teaching middle school, and they were all so deeply relieved to be working with elementary school students instead. So, and they all commented on it. So that just kind of stuck with me.
I believe it. Yeah, just don't, like, tell middle schoolers that. That's mean.
Well, no, of course not.
Yeah.
They're in a developmental stage. It's not entirely their fault.
And then as Luke 7 continues, Jesus, again, is pointing out the false binary in how he and John are being characterized by other people, to point out that it's like a no-win situation. right? No matter what, there's something that people are like, oh, John does this, and Jesus does a different thing, and they're like, oh, but Jesus does this. So very similar to the ways that people treat women, right? In the, like, you're either Mary the Virgin or Mary Magdalene. And while those are, like, not very biblically based characterizations, it's the, like, either you're decried for this or you're decried for the opposite, and there's no in between. There's no winning in that situation. So Jesus points that out and, calls people out on that, because calling people out on bad behavior is actually faithful.
Yeah. In Luke chapter 9, we read that Herod hears rumors and is scared that John has come back from the dead because John hates him that much. No. But yeah, Herod is worried that John has come back from the dead after Herod had him beheaded, which is something that happens off screen in this gospel. We don't actually see it. Mm-hmm. And so perhaps he was concerned that John was only mostly dead. And that he had found himself a miracle man. Who knows? Well, actually, I guess John did find a miracle man. But Jesus did not, come up with a magic pill coated in chocolate to bring John back, which is good because John had been beheaded and swallowing it wouldn't have actually led it anywhere. But moving on.
Ugh.
Yeah. If you're interested in the more complete account of John's beheading, which isn't entirely a creepy thing to say, I suppose, then you can look in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew.
Yes, there's a content notification there for, like, there's definitely,
I mean, it's not especially gory. You don't actually, like, they basically say, and then he beheaded him. But
there's, like, definitely manipulation of a child in that.
Oh, there's a whole bunch of other weird and creepy stuff. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so check that out.
Man, we give the worst book recommendations, don't we?
And then in Luke 11, the disciples are a bit envious of what John did with his disciples by teaching them to pray, and so ask Jesus for instruction on prayer. This is particularly interesting because Kay and I were talking about this, that they probably had some different styles of prayer. Right? So, like, initially when Kay said that, I was like, oh, because John's, like, pretty aesthetic, so I'm, like, thinking contemplative prayer, but no. Okay, whoa.
This is John we're talking about. Like, I think that John's version of prayer would have involved a lot of yelling.
Yes.
Possibly setting things on fire.
Definitely cussing.
Like, yes, absolutely.
Whereas Jesus...
just very exuberant prayer.
Yeah.
Actually, I suppose there's a comment to be made there about Baptists. They do get some things right, absolutely. And... So that just strikes me as John's style, as opposed to Jesus, who suggests that you quietly go into your room and pray when no one's looking at you, which, fair enough. Well, God is looking at you, but God is always looking at you. Just don't think too hard about that or you'll get creeped out.
That's super creepy. Super
Again,
creepy.
Great book recommendations we give. So, yay, Bible.
This is probably a good spot to name that John is considered to be as part of a group of Essenes, and so they are, like, the ones who go out in the desert and in the wilderness and...
Yes, and when we use the word aesthetic to describe John, it's aesthetic and not aesthetic, which is to say it's about simplification and bare bones minimums of your life, as opposed to, like, it looks really pretty. Yes. I mean, I'm not saying John couldn't have been aesthetic as well, because, like, maybe his hair shirt was super stylish.
Well, and there's a good color scheme in the desert and wilderness. Like...
Yeah, absolutely. So he could have been Instagram worthy. We don't know. Yeah, that's not especially what he was known for. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. So there is a group of Pharisees that love money who have heard about the parable of the dishonest manager that Jesus has just told. And so to them, Jesus says, you are trying to justify yourselves in the sight of others, but God knows your heart. For what is prized by human beings is an abomination in the sight of God. And then Jesus says, the law and the prophets were in effect until John came. Since then, the good news of the kingdom of God is proclaimed, and everyone tries to enter it by force. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of a letter in the law to be dropped. So this is a place, and it's a little tricky because there's a lot of context that we need whenever we read the Bible, as we've talked about, but Jesus challenges this notion that is actually a pretty common anti-Semitic thing that Christians do to say, oh, the Old Testament had this, and now Jesus came, and so we don't have to do that anymore because that is bad. And here Jesus is saying, no, actually, this is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, not the erasure of it. And so is kind of holding on. And this is one of the places where we remind ourselves that both Jesus and John were, in fact, Jewish people within Judaism. None of them, they were not intending to start a whole new religion. They were movements within Judaism. And so this space is where...
Hey, there's a parallel there to Martin Luther, isn't there?
Right? Martin Luther, Catholic, his whole life. That there was this movement within Judaism, and it was still very much Jewish. It was still very much rooted in the law, which is to say the Torah, what we call the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, which is, for those of us who speak English and are Christian, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's what when we say the law, that's what we mean. We don't mean this whole set of legal things. Yes, there are legal things implicated and involved, but the law is actually referring to the Torah. So the Torah and the prophets, that those are fulfilled in Jesus in this particular way. Those are also fulfilled for Jewish people in other ways.
Yeah. And then in Luke 20, Jesus runs into some people who try to trick him, and he turns around the conversation by asking about whether John's baptism was of divine nature or human nature. And the people questioning him know that, well, if they say John's baptism was divine, then they will legally get themselves in trouble with the authorities. And if they say that John's baptism was strictly human, the entire crowd listening is going to get extremely angry with them, and then they're going to have to deal with some fallout. And so they basically run away.
Yep.
Which is why you don't get into an argument with Jesus in front of other people, because it's not going to end well for you.
Right. And this is the point in Luke where everything is escalating. Tensions are rising. They're trying to figure out Jesus' crucifixion is very quickly approaching. And so they're trying to figure out how to trap him, how to get him. And this is one of the ways that they try to do that.
And then in Acts chapter 1, we get a couple moments of John as well, because his life continued to have ripple effects in the world. Jesus tells the disciples that John baptized with water, but they will be baptized with the Holy Spirit. Oddly enough, water is also going to be involved in baptisms
in the future.
So, yeah.
I mean, but it's for the disciples, they happened 2 separate times. And then after that, it was, look, they're connected. But this was before the Ascension and before Pentecost, which is when we celebrate the Holy Spirit's presence among us.
And then a few verses later, the disciple identifies John's baptism as the start of Jesus' ministry, which is true in, I believe, all of the Gospels. So
John's baptism of Jesus, the Gospel of John actually is the least clear about what we call the sacraments, so baptism and communion, but
I mean, John is the least clear on
everything.
Many things.
Yeah. When I took my Preaching John course, the way that they talked about it was instead of having the sacraments depicted, the entire gospel was sacramental. So we don't actually get a Last Supper in John in the same way that we do in the other gospels, but we do get a lot of conversation about Jesus as the bread of life and Jesus giving his life for many and those sorts of things. So a similar thing happens in the beginning of John, but all of the Gospels do have, towards the beginning, and certainly before Jesus' public ministry, John's call for baptism of repentance for everyone. So that's one of the few things that actually happens in all 4 Gospels. One of the other things is a feeding of a multitude. Some have more than one, but all of them have at least one feeding of a multitude, which is pretty cool.
Because food is good.
Food and water.
Sure.
It's like communion. So that's the fun of John.
Yay.
So we have 4 readings for actually most of our Advent episodes, because what is usually a psalm reading actually has some other stuff. So our first reading for this episode is Malachi chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. The prophet Malachi says God is sending a messenger who will refine and purify the people, preparing the way for God. So, an obvious theme for this passage is the idea of messengers. And I have been thinking a lot about D&D because I'm working on trying to figure out how to craft a particular D&D campaign for some folks. And so I was thinking about all of the creativity involved in D&D in how you can leave messages or pass along messages. And like, right, druids can recall and notice messages left in druidic or messages left on nature or in nature, but also like I was in a campaign where I was a bard, and so frequently I would be like tasked to communicate with non-verbal creatures. And so I would like pull out my fiddle and like make some noises, and then they would like respond, but like we couldn't actually like communicate in words, so I didn't always know like what their response even meant.
Yeah. Actually, we had a very similar encounter last night when we ran into a large group of folks who we didn't share a language with. And so our bard, one of our bards, the other bard, not me, pulled out their bagpipes and started playing, and we pretended to be entertainers who were just, traveling through a bog, like you do, looking for an audience.
So that's
it worked out, mostly.
But yeah, there are lots of ways to be creative about messengers. There's in Ember in the Ashes, one of the characters passes along messages through bees. So
sure,
there's lots. God speaks through bees all the time. That's why they're dying.
Or if you prefer the movie Jupiter Ascending, because they're they can detect royalty. But
also true. Yeah. In verse 1, we read, "See, I am sending my messenger to prepare the way before me, and the one whom you seek will suddenly come to their temple. Messenger of the covenant in whom you delight. Indeed, they are coming, says the God of hosts." The way that it was phrased with the like, suddenly they're coming to their temple, made me think of like the detective mystery novels where you're like poking around and like the suspenseful music is slowly starting to build, and then all of a sudden like somebody shows up and is like, "What are you doing here?" And then you have to like tell them that you're snooping on them or whatever. Or, run away and try not to be killed.
Yes. In verse 2, we read, "For God is like a refiner's fire." So there are any number of stories where a person has to go through training, and usually there's some kind of montage, maybe with music if it's a movie or a TV show. And they hate their trainer who is super tough on them. But then it's revealed in the end that because of how tough that trainer was, they've been magnificently trained and they're super skilled now. But there are also a handful of stories, and I'm not actually going to tell you which ones they are, because this is always a plot twist, from classic age sci-fi, that took that trope, and through either time travel or cloning, or I think in at least one case both, which got kind of complicated, made the trainer in the story be a later or another version of the trainee, so that they were training themselves. Because, of course, no one is going to be as hard on you as you yourself will be, because you know yourself so well, and so you know, like, what's hard for you and what's not.
Ooh. Also, though, you might be hardest on yourself because, poor self-esteem and an entire culture that says that you are worthless. That's hard to, like,
well, believe. Yes. And that was quite a truth bomb. But
hashtag anti-capitalist.
Sure. Also, therapy is good for you, just
Yay,
saying.
Therapy.
Not any particular reason. So now my question is, who knows you better and therefore can be a more difficult trainer for you? Yourself or God?
Interesting.
Does God know you better than you know yourself?
I like to hope so. So I was reading that and the next verse of, "They will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and will purify the descendants of Levi and refine them like gold and silver." And it reminded me of when I was a camper in high school and later a staff member at Rainbow Trail Lutheran Camp. We used to make pewter crosses at camp, and so we would take like plaster and carve out the like mirror image of what we wanted to pour, and then the person who was doing it would come and would like do the actual pouring of the pewter because, a hot
Don't
metal,
give
melted
small children
metal.
molten metal. That's
I
a
mean,
bad
we
plan.
were high schoolers, but also don't give high schoolers molten metal or access to it. But I do remember, like, whenever that person would heat up the metal, there would always be a little bit at the like top that they'd have to like scrape off. That was the like stuff that had become impure. Like you pour the pewter in, and then there's always like some that you have to cut off and that sort of thing, and then you just put it back in, and whatever's impure kind of rises to the surface, so you can scrape it off easily.
Sure.
So that's I was like, oh, I know actually like some of how to purify metal. Yay!
Cool. And in verse 4 we read, "Then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to the Lord, as in the days of old and as in former years." So a good bit of what makes an offering or a gift pleasing is the spirit in which it was given. Like a 3-year-old might hand you something that is literally covered in spit. But if they are cheerful and excited about it, then how can you not be, right? At least you can fake it.
Yeah, some of my favorite PJs are like, I have a pair of PJs that are ridiculously warm and thick and have Snoopy, and I have a like birthday card that has Snoopy with scribbles on it, and it's because they picked it out.
Oh, my mom has an old tradition of giving either pajamas or socks or both with completely ridiculous patterns on them at Christmas because that's just something she likes to do, and she is so cheerful about it. And also, like, she always chooses decent quality stuff, so it's going to be warm and soft and comfortable. Yeah. It's just going to look completely ridiculous, and you're not going to want to be seen by it in anyone who you actually want to look good in front of. So,
yeah. Well, and that's like last year I asked for PJ pants, but Lily's like, yeah, the presents that Lily gives were like, especially when she first started being able to pick stuff out, then it's like, that's my favorite set of D&D dice, and yeah.
Sure. And so, related to that, I was thinking about the Doctor Who episode, The End of the World, with the Ninth Doctor.
Which one is the Ninth Doctor?
The Ninth Doctor is Christopher Eccleston.
Okay. I know their names,
My favorite.
But this is like the one situation in which I know actors' names more than like...
Yeah, that's probably fair. Well, because they all have the same name. Because yeah,
exactly.
But the Doctor realizes, as he arrives to this party, which he is totally gate-crashing, but not admitting to it, that the guests were supposed to bring a gift for each other, and he's empty-handed. And so, in a moment of inspiration, he gives them air from his lungs, and breathes gently on them, as a gift. And I figure, especially with the looks on some of these people's faces, like they're all different alien races, and so it's a little hard to tell, but I think at least one or two of the guests knew exactly what he was doing, and that he had been caught out and didn't have anything. But they let him get away with it because he has this absolutely cheerful and giving nature to him when he's doing that. And it's more about the spirit of the gift than the content, you know?
Yeah, and it's not at all, like, creepy or problematic that, like, some white guy is, like, breathing on people and calling that good enough for everybody else who brought actual gifts. Well, something, hashtag mediocre white men, something, mumble grumble. I do appreciate the spirit of gifts.
Absolutely. And our second reading is not a psalm, but in the place of one, from Luke chapter 1, verses 68 through 79. Zechariah praises God at the birth of his son, John, who will become the baptizer.
So this is right after Zechariah obviously gets his voice back,
and now he can sing.
Yeah, and so he sings. And this is one of the canticles which we talked about in our deep dive for the first Sunday of Christmas last year. It's one of the 3 that happen in the Gospel of Luke. All of them are in the Gospel of Luke. So, yay, canticles.
You know, I just realized that between the two of us, you are more like the Gospel of Matthew because you continually reference the things that we have done previously, which is what Matthew does all the time, referencing the Hebrew Scriptures. So,
I mean, yes.
Which is great and useful.
So one of the themes in this is the idea of rescue, that Zechariah is praising for God's work in rescuing God's people. And it reminded me of Laia in the Ember and the Ashes series, who towards the end of the first book, so spoilers, is actually rescued by Helene. And while this canticle talks about being rescued from enemies, there is also this way that they, at that point, were considering each other enemies. And so to be rescued by an enemy is also a whole other level of,
And in verse 71, we read that we would be saved from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us. But really, who is our enemy in the end?
Mm-hmm.
For example, this verse made me think of a Bat Universe comic. It's a comic that's in the universe of Batman. That basically is the easiest way to describe it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like the only universe in which bats exist. That's not what I was looking for. And in this moment in the comic, there is a girl running away from someone who is attacking her, and she spots Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy trying to do something in an alley, and she runs to them for help, despite the fact that Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy are both actually, villains in most of these stories. But the thing is that even if they are currently trying to pull off some kind of heist, and even if they are usually the bad guys in these stories, they are also not going to put up with an adult man trying to hurt a child. And she's pretty clear about that. And it's a great little moment, and I enjoyed it, and we can include a link to that in the episode description.
Yeah, that's awesome. I do think that those are like, there are particular places where it's like, we're evil and we're villains, but
we have standards.
Yeah, and also, like, Poison Ivy is trying to, like, help regrow the earth and regrow vegetation on the earth and save the earth. So, like, villain. Yeah.
And, like, Harley Quinn's been through a lot, and she actively doesn't want other people to have to go through that. And so I like that they have depth and character to them.
The Batman universe is one of the ones where I'm like, some of the villains are actually, like, not that bad. Billionaire Batman, but yeah.
And, like, there are others who, okay, yes, fine, they're evil, they like stealing things, but they're also frickin' hilarious, and the world could use a little more comic relief. Come on.
Yeah. Truth. In verse 72, we read, "Thus God has shown the mercy promised to our ancestors and has remembered their holy covenant." And so this idea of, like, promise to parents or ancestors for their children or descendants reminded me both of Snape's commitment, not directly to Lily, but to Lily's kid, to keeping Harry alive. Now, Snape does it in a really terrible and abusive way, but he does commit, and, like, towards the end, we start to see that he actually cares about Harry staying alive more than any of the other characters who are kind to
After
Harry.
all, if Harry's dead, Snape can't bully him anymore, and that would be frustrating. So.
Yes, not where I was going, but that is also a thing. But it also reminded me of in Gilmore Girls, which is a show that I grew up with and loved, and I still think has like the best series finale of any of them. But Rory promises to be Lorelai for Lane's kids, because Lorelai Gilmore was the place where Lane could escape and be her whole self. Yeah. Within a stricter family context. And so Rory promises to be that for Lane, which actually means, like, being a place where, like, if her kids want to read the Bible, they can go to Rory to, like, read the Bible and stuff.
Yeah.
Which I think is a beautiful, like, I don't know, the ways that we care for each other's, as adults, care for each other's kids, or as kids are cared for by our parents' friends and stuff.
I especially appreciate when parents recognize that they might not be the perfect measure by which all things should be measured, and therefore maybe their kids will have different interests, or maybe their kids will want to rebel a little bit and try something else. And giving them a safe place to do that is incredibly valuable.
Yeah, it's so important for kids to have other adults who are not their parents in their life. That's one of my favorite things I'm doing right now, as a person without kids, but with friends with kids. And then in verse 78, we read, "By the tender mercy of our God, the dawn from on high will break upon us." And it took everything in me to not sing that, but I also haven't sung that in a very long time, so wouldn't even sing it at all close to right, as opposed to...
And you haven't finished your coffee yet.
True, although it's almost gone. As opposed to my usual, like, singing it only kind of right. It would be, like, utterly terrible. Apparently I'm on a missing camp kick these days. I'm going to blame it on the fact that it has not snowed and it's November when we're recording this.
Don't worry, Emily. I promise you are just as camp as you want all the time.
But that idea of the dawn from on high breaking upon us reminded me so vividly of the times that I was at camp, or also Easter morning, because I grew up in Colorado, and so our sunrise service on Easter morning was literally on top of a mountain. But like watching the sunrise, watching it break, slowly build, and then all of a sudden that moment when you get the sunlight directly in your eyes and have to like start looking at the sunrise differently when it breaks over the mountains. And I think I will always be biased in favor of mountains, but I think there is something special and unique about the way sun rises over mountains compared to flat horizon lines, and it's just beautiful and feels both tender and powerful to me.
Sure. In verse 79, we read, "To give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet in the way of peace." Okay, so we've talked before on this podcast about needing to be careful with dark and light imagery in the Bible, because especially in America, you can end up making some incredibly racist connotations.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a verse where the original intended meaning is more clear. Why do you sit when you're in the dark? Because if you get up and you move, you might fall down the stairs.
Unless you learned how to walk in the dark at camp like me.
Well, okay, I don't know what that's a reference to.
No, like there's particular skills that you could, like you can learn how to walk in the dark.
Yes,
and not just
but most people don't have that, and like even if you have those skills, you can still fall down the stairs.
It's true. It's true. It's a little harder, but yeah.
It is far more peaceful to move when you have some light to see by where you're going, and especially since you are probably not Wile E. Coyote, and gravity does not only work on you once you realize you're about to fall down. Gravity does not usually have dramatic timing. I'm just saying. If gravity has dramatic timing for you, then you might want to like go get yourself studied by some physicists or something, or possibly magicians. So.
Yeah. And then our third reading is Philippians chapter 1, verses 3 through 11. Paul gives thanks for the recipients of the letter because of how they have shared God's grace together. So one of the themes in this that comes up is the journey that Paul and the recipients, the church in Philippi, are on together, the journey of faith. And it reminded me of this song that we used to listen to during staff training at camp right after we had climbed or attempted to climb Eagle Peak, but it was Yukon Sally, and it's this like fantastic song, and I'll try and find a link to send you to.
See, I immediately want to hum that song title to the tune of Mustang Sally, and I'm pretty sure that's probably not accurate.
Correct, not accurate. But Yukon Sally is like about climbing up to the top of mountains and stuff, and Helicopter Joe just like takes people up to the very top so they can get a picture and go back down, and Yukon Sally's like, no, cheating. It's about more than that. In verse 5, we read, "Because of your sharing in the gospel from the first day until now," and this idea of being a part of the movement for a very long time from the beginning. And it reminded me of, in the Graceling book and series, Katz's council that she creates to work against the corrupt kings. The initial members of that council, who also happen to be like some of her closest friends, though not all of them, and some of them grow into closer friends, will always have a particular place and role in their society and relationship, even when new members are welcomed. So new people join the council all the time, and the people who have been there the longest have particular roles, which is like good and bad. I think there is space for recognition of elders in movements, and also an important space of finding new ways to be and recognizing and lifting up new leadership and new membership.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in verse 6 we read, "I am confident of this, that the one who began a good work among you will bring it to completion by the day of Jesus Christ." So one of the things that you have to keep in mind, particularly with the post-gospel books in the New Testament, is that Paul expected the day of Jesus Christ, that is the day that Jesus returned, to be pretty soon.
Like any second now for him.
Yeah. So within his lifetime, definitely, and possibly much sooner than that. And so when he says this, he is not giving extremely faint praise by giving an enormously long deadline. Like, don't worry, I'm sure you'll finish it sometime in the next 3,000 years. No, that's not what he was going for. This isn't like most of the Quest in Skyrim, where you can take as much time as you want to do something, no matter how urgent things might be. Somebody says, oh, if you don't finish this by tomorrow, then we're all going to die and the world will end. And then you wander off and do something else for 3 months and come back and no one notices. Paul expects this to be more of a timed mission kind of thing. So,
yeah. In verse 7, we read, "It is right for me to think this way about all of you, because you hold me in your heart. For all of you share in God's grace with me, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel." So this is, right, Paul speaking of imprisonment for doing what is right. And Paul actually was imprisoned, and it's not a, like, pretty or joyful thing. It is actually, like, a bad thing, and being imprisoned is not good, not fun. I can tell you that from my own experience, but it reminded me of Elias in the Ember in the Ashes series, who refuses to kill Laia, who technically is a traitor and a spy, but is also, like, a good person. And Elias refuses to kill her, and so then is imprisoned and actually, like, sentenced to death because of that. But there's also all sorts of justice workers who are imprisoned for doing what is right, for resisting evil. And so, again, law does not equal justice.
Absolutely. And then in verse 9 we read, "And this is my prayer, that your love may overflow more and more with knowledge and full insight." So the show Babylon 5 was set on a space station, and in the episode Confessions and Lamentations, there is an epidemic going on among one of the races on board, the Markab. And Delenn, who is not a Markab person, wants to go into their quarantine area to help them out. And when it's pointed out to her that she is not one of them, her reply is, "I didn't know that similarity was required for the exercise of compassion.
Ooh.
They are afraid. We wish to do what little we can." And that, I think, is a lovely example of what love overflowing looks like.
Well done, Delenn.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
She's a really interesting character. Also, the actress that played her just died this year.
Oh.
I think it was this year. West Nile at 65. Very sad.
Ooh.
Yeah.
That is a beautiful...
Yeah, they wrote really well for her. She got several very nice lines. And our gospel reading for this episode is Luke chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. John the Baptizer begins his ministry in a particular time and place and prepares the way for Jesus.
So one of the themes in this passage is the space for world building and exposition. Definitely there's a lot of, like, here, let me place this in historical context. But it just reminded me a lot of, like, the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbits, and so much of what J.R.R. Tolkien did was to build the world and to describe it in such detail. And for him...
But if you didn't know what the third tree on the left looked like, then how would you understand hobbits at all, Emily?
Exactly. Right? For him, as... slightly less so, but as for Luke... you have to, like, describe it in, like, you have to be so clear about it so that you can convince people that it is true and real. And it's like, okay, you're going a little bit overboard. Luke is Luke, and so, you know, do you, bud. But, yeah, that, like, these are all of the people that are in charge and responsible and have authority and power in this whole thing.
Exactly. So, for example, in verse 1, we read, "In the 15th year of the reign of Emperor Tiberius, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was ruler of Galilee, and his brother Philip ruler of the region of," you know, even I'm not going to try to pronounce those.
I would say Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias ruler
and
of
also
Galilee.
Another guy. Exactly. But this isn't just setting a particular time. It's also, when you read it's in the 15th year, that gives you a date, approximately, of when this was happening. Mm-hmm. But that's not why Luke goes on to explain all of these other people. It's also introducing you to several of the major players in this story, who we've already brought up in at least a couple cases. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of like how at the start of 10 Things I Hate About You, Cameron gets a tour of his new school, and handily enough, that doubles as an introduction to the culture of that school for you watching the movie. Mm-hmm. Funny how that works.
Yeah. And the specific people that are mentioned here that come up again, we talked about Herod and his brother Philip in our deep dive into John, because Herod in particular has a huge impact on John's life and, in fact, death.
Yeah.
But also...
I don't really know that you can have a bigger impact on someone's life than by, ending it.
Yeah, but, But also, Pontius Pilate comes up in the stories of Jesus' crucifixion in all of the Gospels, including the Gospel of Luke.
Yeah.
And then in the second half of verse 4, we read, "The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the becoming one, make the paths straight. And this is the quote from Isaiah, the beginning of the quote from Isaiah that we're talking about earlier. And first off, this, like, the grammar is different according to the Gospels than it is according to Isaiah. In Isaiah, it's the voice of one crying out, colon, in the wilderness prepare the way of God. And in Luke and the Gospels, it's the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, colon, prepare the way of God. So just to, like, name those inconsistencies and the ways that we interpret things and read things differently according to our context. But also, this idea of, like, being the one to, like, go in front and prepare the way reminded me of the Weasley twins in the Chamber of Secrets when everybody thinks that Harry is the heir of Slytherin, and so they're like, make way, look out! Heir of Slytherin coming through, really bad guy. And, like, they're doing it obviously sarcastically and making fun in a way that really actually lifts up Harry's spirits, but
and also lets him get to class, which is helpful.
Also true.
But
but
probably the only time they actually encouraged education in the entire series. But
yeah, the Weasley twins. I mean, the Weasley twins encourage education, just not formal education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people learn all kinds of things from them. They don't necessarily want to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will always think of them for that part.
Yeah. And then in verse 5 we read, every valley shall be filled, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough ways made smooth. So this is not exactly a book I necessarily recommend, although it's very interesting. I believe I've mentioned previously this is one of those books where the author could have written this book or gone to therapy, but didn't need to do both. But Robert Heinlein wrote a book called Job, which is an exploration of his issues with religion, particularly Christianity. And in that, he explained how this particular prophecy would come to pass by saying that it happened after the bodily resurrection, because if everyone who was ever alive came back bodily and was walking around on the planet Earth, enough dirt would get pushed around just by people walking, so that the Rockies would get leveled out and the Grand Canyon would get filled in. And so now, every time I read something like this verse in the Bible, that's my mental image, which is something I just had to share with you all, because if I have to put up with it, so do you.
Yeah, I actually, like, that does not feel good or heavenly at all. Like, I get that it does make
Not really, no. Like,
place...
John is talking about, like, things are going to get easier. It's going to get better.
It's going to get more accessible.
That is not the,
Yeah, but it is, like, as someone who grew up in the Rockies, the idea of my mountains getting...
I like them too.
It's just so sad, and I love mountains, and so that just makes me sad. In verse 6 we read, and all flesh shall see the salvation of God. And I think I was a little loopy by the time I did this last night when I couldn't sleep, and so my immediate response was like, what would salvation look like to an elephant? Right, like, all flesh.
Or a duck-billed platypus.
Yeah, like, we're talking about all flesh. So what does salvation look like to non-human animals?
Absolutely. Possibly, humans not trying to kill them anymore. I'm just saying. But,
maybe that, would make sense or something. Yeah. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the third Sunday of Advent. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdstatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. As the ancient Christians said,
Pax Vobiscum.